She told me she doesn't usually let people this close, but somehow I did. The first time I saw her, it was on a quiet Saturday morning. I had been on my usual walk through the neighborhood, the kind of aimless stroll where the mind drifts as much as the feet do. That's when I noticed her, standing near my neighbor's front porch, struggling with 2 grocery bags that looked far heavier than they should have been. She was striking not in a flashy way, but with the kind of quiet elegance that made the world slow down for a moment. She looked to be in her early 40s, her hair just grazing her shoulders, catching the morning light in soft amber strands. There was a calm confidence in the way she carried herself, but at the same time, a faint hesitation lingered in her movements, like someone who had been careful not to let the world in for a long time. I found myself instinctively walking over, offering help. "Here, let me take one of those," I said, trying to sound casual, though my palms were suddenly clammy. Her eyes met mine, a warm hazel that seemed to assess me quickly, then soften ever so slightly. She hesitated for a fraction of a second before nodding and handing me the heavier bag. That small motion, the way her fingers brushed mine as I took the bag, sent an unexpected jolt of awareness through me. It was such a fleeting touch, yet I couldn't shake the feeling it meant more than the action itself. As we walked together toward her car, I noticed the subtle details. The way she shifted her weight slightly forward as if to protect herself from the world, the faint scent of her perfume mixing with the crisp morning air, the soft sound of her laughter when I made a clumsy joke about carrying groceries like a grown man should. There was a grace in her presence that made ordinary moments feel heavier with significance. I tried to focus on practical conversation, asking where she was headed, commenting on the weather, but my mind kept circling back to small, intimate observations. The tilt of her head when she laughed, the brief pause before she spoke as if carefully choosing her words, the warmth of her hand brushing against mine again when I handed her the bag. Each small gesture hinted at a complexity behind her calm exterior, a life experience she hadn't fully shared yet. When we reached her car, she smiled, a small, almost shy smile that didn't quite reach her eyes, but it was genuine enough to make my heart skip. "Thank you," she said, her voice soft but clear. "I appreciate it." There was a slight edge of reserve in her tone, a subtle barrier she seemed to hold between herself and anyone who might come too close. And yet, that barrier didn't feel like rejection. Felt like a challenge, a quiet test. I didn't know it then, but that brief encounter would linger in my mind for days, the warmth of her presence and the echo of her hesitant smile imprinting themselves in ways I hadn't expected. She was someone who didn't let people in easily, but for some reason, in that small moment, I felt as if she had allowed me a glimpse into a world that very few ever saw. As I walked back home, I realized that my heart was already a little unsettled, curious, and undeniably aware of her. An awareness that would quietly grow into something far more complicated in the days to come. Over the next week, I kept noticing her in small, almost accidental ways. The first time wasn't planned. She was at the local cafe, the same one I frequented for late morning coffee. I saw her from across the room, sitting alone at a small table by the window, a paperback open in front of her, sunlight spilling across her hair like a halo. I felt that familiar pull, the quiet curiosity that had taken root in me since our first encounter. She looked up, caught my gaze, and for a brief second, her eyes softened in recognition. I offered a small nod, and she responded with a delicate smile, almost shy, as if she hadn't expected to see me there. That fleeting acknowledgement sent a subtle thrill through me. Over the next few days, these chance encounters became patterns. At the post office, in the park, even while walking her dog. Each meeting carried the same quiet tension, the understated dance of proximity and hesitation. She would let me walk beside her just a little too long, laugh a little too softly at my jokes, and occasionally, our hands would brush, brief, accidental touches that left an unexpected warmth lingering in my chest. It wasn't just the physical closeness. It was the small glimpses into her world. She began sharing tiny details, fragments of stories about her life, little anecdotes about her work or memories of her kids, all delivered casually, yet with a subtle vulnerability. It was as if she were testing the waters, allowing me in, piece by piece, without crossing the boundary of what felt safe for her. I noticed everything. The tilt of her head when she listened intently, the way her fingers traced the rim of her coffee cup, the faint scent of her perfume mingling with the rich aroma of the cafe. She had a presence that filled space softly but unmistakably, and I found myself craving those moments, lingering in the edges of her world without knowing how close I could get. One afternoon, we ended up on a park bench together, the late spring sun warming our shoulders. She leaned slightly toward me, just enough that our arms almost touched. When a breeze lifted a strand of her hair across her face, I instinctively brushed it back, my fingers grazing her cheek ever so lightly. She didn't pull away. Instead, her eyes held mine for a heartbeat longer than necessary, a fleeting invitation wrapped in hesitation. I couldn't tell if she was aware of the effect these small gestures had, or if she was testing me in her quiet, measured way. All I knew was that my chest felt tighter every time we parted, and I was already counting the hours until the next accidental meeting. By the end of the week, it was undeniable. Our interactions were no longer just casual encounters. They were a silent conversation, a dance of proximity and restraint, where every glance, laugh, and brush of hands spoke more than words ever could. She hadn't yet let anyone in completely, but with each fleeting moment, she was letting me closer than anyone had in a long time. And for some reason, I didn't want her to stop. It happened one evening unexpectedly. I had been helping my neighbor with some small chores, and she appeared at the edge of the yard, carrying a box of old photo albums she wanted to sort through before donating. I offered to help, and, surprisingly, she accepted without hesitation this time. There was something different about her demeanor that day. Usually composed, she seemed slightly more relaxed, though a quiet tension lingered beneath the surface, like a secret waiting to be shared. As we carried the boxes into her living room, our hands brushed more than once, accidental touches that lingered just a heartbeat too long. Each brush seemed deliberate, though I wasn't sure if it was hers or just my imagination. We sat on the carpet, sorting through photos and memorabilia. She showed me pictures of her children when they were younger, snapshots of vacations and family gatherings, memories she usually kept private. As she handed me a photo, our fingers touched, and I felt a warmth radiate from the brief contact. Her hand lingered just long enough for me to notice, and for a moment, neither of us said anything. The silence between us was comfortable, charged with an unspoken acknowledgement that something more than friendship was threading its way through these small, careful interactions. I could tell she was testing herself as much as she was testing me, allowing me into a part of her life that she usually guarded fiercely. She spoke softly about her divorce, the ways it had changed her, the moments of loneliness that still crept in. There was a vulnerability in her eyes, a fleeting hesitancy, that made the room feel smaller, more intimate, as if the rest of the world had faded away. At one point, she shifted closer, picking up another photo album. Her shoulder brushed mine. It was subtle, almost accidental, but it sent a ripple through me. I caught my breath without thinking, and she didn't pull away. Instead, she seemed to pause, as if testing the boundaries of how much closeness she could allow. I realized then that these moments, touches, glances, shared silences, were not random. She was letting me in piece by piece, granting me access to spaces most people never reached. It was exhilarating and terrifying at the same time. I wanted to comfort her, to show her she didn't have to hold herself so carefully, but I also knew I had to respect her pace. We continued sorting through the albums, laughing softly at old hairstyles and fashion choices, teasing gently, all the while lingering in each other's presence longer than necessary. It wasn't romance yet, not in a conventional sense, but it was something equally potent. Trust. The kind of trust that only forms when someone slowly lowers the walls they've built around themselves. By the time the evening ended, I realized that our relationship had shifted subtly but unmistakably. She had allowed me closer than anyone else in years, closer than even her closest friends, in her own quiet, deliberate way. And when she said it, almost as an afterthought, her voice tinged with hesitation. I don't usually let people this close. I understood the weight of it. It wasn't a warning. It was an opening. And for the first time, I felt like I wasn't just on the outside looking in. I was finally inside a part of her world that very few ever saw. After that evening with the photo albums, I couldn't stop thinking about her. Her presence had settled into my mind in a way that was both comforting and disorienting. I found myself replaying her small gestures, the way her fingers lingered just a second too long on a photo, the soft brush of her shoulder against mine, the hesitant smile that seemed to hide more than it revealed. I began to notice her everywhere, in the spaces between my thoughts. Walking past the park bench where we had shared coffee, I imagined her sitting there, sunlight in her hair, the faint scent of perfume catching the breeze. At the grocery store, I caught myself wondering if she'd be browsing the same aisle. And when she wasn't, I felt a subtle, inexplicable ache. It wasn't just desire, I realized that. It was something deeper. Admiration, curiosity, and an overwhelming urge to protect her without seeming intrusive. And yet, there was hesitation. The age difference, though subtle in conversation, loomed large in my mind. What would people think? Was I reading too much into her small gestures, interpreting friendliness as something it wasn't? I felt the weight of possibility and the danger of overstepping. Our encounters continued, slightly more frequent, slightly more intimate, but each one became a delicate dance. I noticed how she softened when I laughed at her jokes, the way her eyes lingered on me longer than necessary, the brief brush of hands when passing objects or adjusting her coat. Every gesture spoke volumes, yet there was an invisible barrier she maintained. She allowed me close, but never too close. I began to see her in a new light, not just a graceful, elegant woman, but someone carrying the weight of experience and caution. She exuded confidence, yet there were moments when her vulnerability shone through, tiny cracks in the composure she showed the world. Sometimes, when she thought I wasn't watching, her gaze would drift slightly downward, lips pressed together as if weighing her words, measuring her trust. And I realized I was falling, slowly, inexorably, into a space I hadn't intended to enter. My feelings were complicated, tangled with respect, desire, and the fear of losing what we already shared if I moved too quickly. Every accidental brush of hands, every shared glance, felt like a question left unanswered. Was she testing me, or testing herself? Did she even notice how much I noticed? There were nights when I would lie awake, replaying our interactions, imagining a hand held, a shoulder leaned on, a laugh shared in the quiet of her living room. The yearning was there, but so was restraint. I knew the value of patience in this fragile rhythm. Too fast, and I might break the trust she was slowly extending. Yet, every hesitation, every small barrier she maintained, only made the moments when she leaned in, even slightly, feel infinitely more electric. I understood now what she meant by, "I don't usually let people this close." She was allowing me glimpses, fragments of a life most people didn't see, and I had to honor that. As we parted one evening after a casual coffee, her hand brushed mine in farewell. So subtle it might have been accidental, yet intentional enough to leave my fingers tingling. I walked home with a full chest and a racing mind, conflicted and exhilarated in equal measure. She was becoming essential to my world, and I had no idea how far I could follow her without losing myself, or scaring her away. It started with a casual invitation, something so ordinary it almost didn't register at first. She asked if I wanted to come over for tea one evening. Nothing formal, no pretense of a dinner party or an event, just tea. That simplicity carried a weight I could feel in my chest. Accepting felt like stepping into her world, a world she only let a few people inhabit, and I knew that every step I took had to be careful. Her apartment was warm and inviting, the kind of space that made you want to slow down and breathe. The soft glow of a lamp bathed the living room in gentle light, and the faint aroma of baked goods lingered in the air. She moved gracefully around the kitchen, her hair falling naturally across her shoulders, brushing lightly against her back. I couldn't help but notice how even these small, everyday movements carried a quiet elegance that seemed to captivate everything around her. We sat on the couch, tea steaming gently between us, and for the first time, I saw her fully. Beyond the composed exterior she showed the world. She spoke about her life, her divorce, and the subtle, lingering regrets that shaped her. Her voice softened when she spoke about her children, and I caught the tiniest quiver in her tone when recalling moments of loneliness. She didn't shy away from vulnerability, and yet there was a measured caution in the way she chose her words. I listened intently, noticing how she occasionally leaned slightly closer when making a point, her arm brushing mine against the couch. There was a deliberate gentleness in her movements, as if she were testing how much closeness she could allow. At one point, when handing me a sugar cube for my tea, our fingers touched briefly, but enough to send a shiver through me. She didn't pull away. Instead, her eyes met mine, holding a quiet acknowledgement of the intimacy shared in that fleeting contact. We laughed over small, mundane things, the messiness of a recipe, the peculiar habits of her cat, but the laughter carried a new weight, a shared understanding. Silences weren't uncomfortable. They were moments of quiet connection, where the world outside ceased to exist. I found myself watching her more closely than ever, noticing the subtleties. The tilt of her head, the way her lips curved when amused, the warmth in her eyes when she glanced at me. At one point, she spoke softly about her fear of being hurt again, her words almost a whisper. I instinctively reached for her hand, resting it gently in mine. It was a simple, careful gesture, yet it carried everything words could not: comfort, understanding, and the acknowledgement that I was there, fully present, without judgment. By the time I left, I felt a shift in the air between us. Something had deepened, unspoken yet undeniable. She had allowed me not just into her apartment, but into the fragile, guarded spaces of her heart. And in return, I realized I was no longer just an observer. I had become a participant, entrusted with fragments of her world that few ever saw. That evening, as I walked home with the cool night air brushing against my skin, I carried a warmth that was entirely hers. The slow-burning tension, the careful touches, the intimate conversations. They had all begun to intertwine into something neither of us could ignore. And I knew, with quiet certainty, that the next encounter would not be like the ones before. Something had shifted, subtly but irrevocably. It was one of those rare evenings when the world outside seemed to pause, the kind that makes every small detail feel magnified. She had invited me over again, casually, but there was a difference in the air, an unspoken weight that made me aware of every movement, every glance, every breath. We sat on her couch, close but not quite touching, yet every inch of space between us seemed charged with unspoken words. The room was bathed in soft, amber light from a single lamp, casting gentle shadows across her face. I noticed the subtle curve of her jaw, the way her hair fell over one shoulder, the warmth of her presence filling the space in a way that left me almost breathless. Our conversation began lightly, as it always did, but soon drifted into deeper territory. She spoke of moments she regretted, of days when loneliness felt like a shadow she couldn't shake, of the quiet fear of letting anyone in again. Her voice trembled slightly, not with sadness, but with the vulnerability of someone allowing trust to seep through carefully guarded walls. I listened, silently absorbing every word, feeling the weight of her openness settle into my chest. Then came the subtle gestures, the brush of hands as we reached for the same book, the occasional touch of her shoulder when she laughed, leaning in slightly closer than before. Every movement felt deliberate, every touch magnified by the growing tension between us. My heart raced with awareness of proximity, yet I moved slowly, deliberately, letting her set the pace. At one point, she looked at me in a way that stopped me in my tracks. Her eyes searched mine, a mixture of curiosity, longing, and hesitation. There was a pause, a heartbeat that stretched into an eternity, where the air between us seemed to vibrate with everything we had yet to say. I realized then that this was no longer casual friendship. The feelings had grown too large to ignore, too tangled to retreat from. I reached out carefully, brushing my hand against hers. She didn't pull away. Instead, our fingers intertwined gently, naturally, as if this closeness had always been meant to happen. The touch was electric but tender, safe. No words were needed. The simple gesture said everything I couldn't yet put into sentences. We remained like that for a while, hands held, sitting side by side. The silence between us was not empty. It was full of acknowledgement, of trust, of the quiet admission that we were no longer simply keeping each other at arm's length. Her head tilted slightly, almost unconsciously, towards mine, and I felt the warmth of her presence like a flame close enough to feel its heat without fear of burning. By the time I left that night, the realization was undeniable. I had fallen, fully, irrevocably, and she had let me in far deeper than she had intended. Our relationship had shifted from cautious curiosity to something far more intimate, something that neither of us could ignore. And yet, there was no rush, no forced resolution. Only the shared understanding that we were on the cusp of something beautiful, fragile, and wholly our own. As I stepped outside into the cool night air, I felt her lingering gaze follow me, and I knew she felt it too. The quiet, unspoken acknowledgement of a connection that was no longer just slow. The days that followed felt different, lighter, quieter, yet charged with a new awareness. Something had shifted between us, subtle yet undeniable. Our previous meetings, once filled with small hesitations and careful boundaries, now carried a softness, a comfort that spoke of trust earned and walls slowly lowered. One evening, she invited me over again, not for tea or casual conversation this time, but just to sit together in her living room. The city outside was quiet, the hum of distant traffic a gentle backdrop to the warmth inside her home. I noticed the little details, the way the soft lamp light highlighted her features, the gentle curve of her lips as she smiled, the warmth of her presence that seemed to make the entire room feel safer. We sat close, not out of necessity, but because it felt natural. I found myself instinctively adjusting the throw blanket over her shoulders when she shivered, and she didn't pull away. When I reached to hand her a cup of tea, our fingers brushed and lingered. It was a touch that spoke of something more than friendship, an acknowledgement that we were no longer just testing boundaries but exploring a closeness we had both been hesitant to name. Our conversation flowed with ease. We spoke of dreams, of past regrets, of the small joys that had gone unnoticed in the chaos of life. There were pauses, filled not with discomfort but with understanding. A quiet space where words were unnecessary. At one point, she spoke softly about her fears, admitting that letting someone in after so long felt both thrilling and terrifying. I reached for her hand again, this time deliberately, letting her feel the steadiness of my presence. Her fingers interlaced with mine, and I sensed a relief in her posture, a subtle surrender to the connection we had built. There was laughter, too, light, easy, and unguarded. She leaned slightly against my shoulder as we shared a private joke, and I felt the warmth of her hair brush my arm. I noticed the way her eyes lingered on mine, no longer filled with hesitation but with recognition of the trust, the care, and the mutual affection that had grown between us. The moment was tender, quiet, and infinitely significant. There was no dramatic declaration, no rushing to label what had been building for weeks. Instead, there was acceptance, a mutual understanding that we had found something rare and precious. She rested her head gently against my shoulder, and I held her careful, steady, letting the silence speak for both of us. As I left that evening, the cool night air brushing against my face, I felt a sense of peace I hadn't known before. We had crossed the line from cautious curiosity to quiet intimacy, each step measured, respectful, and wholly sincere. The connection we shared wasn't a fleeting spark. It was a slow-burning flame that had been nurtured with patience, trust, and care. And in that moment, I understood something important. Love didn't always arrive in grand gestures or dramatic confessions. Sometimes, it came quietly, in the gentle brushing of hands, the warmth of a shared space, and the unspoken acknowledgement that someone had finally let you in. I looked back once before closing the door behind me, and she smiled. A smile that held relief, trust, and an unspoken promise. I smiled back, knowing that this was only the beginning, that the path we had started walking together was one we would navigate slowly, carefully, but completely. And for the first time, I felt the certainty of something lasting. She had let me close, and I wasn't letting go. Renewing curiosity, but something that had begun to ignite. If you felt the slow burn tension and heartfelt moments in this story, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the bell so you never miss a new romantic story. Share your thoughts in the comments. What would you do if someone let you in like this? 2 hearts.